Is conflict between the United States and China inevitable?
It's not inevitable. The idea that China and United States will get into conflict comes from this argument called Thucydides Trap, which was a popularization of an old international relations theory called power transition. And Thucydides Trap refers to the Peloponnesian War that the historian Thucydides lived through and wrote about, when Sparta grew back in ancient Greece. Sparta grew concerned about Athens' growing power, war followed, and Graham Allison, the person who popularized this theory, took that example and then looked at some other historical examples, mostly from European history, and basically argued that when an existing hegemon, a great power, is threatened by the growth of another power, conflict is likely. But even in the cases that Allison looked at, not all of them ended with conflict. So even if we take the theory, the argument at face value, that its findings of historical pattern, it's not deterministic. It suggests that conflict becomes likely when a rising power approaches the strength of the existing hegemon. But there are also, of course, critiques of the argument itself. That's the historical examples focus on a relatively limited slice of history. There are arguments by scholars who studied especially East Asia that these generalizations don't apply. The pattern doesn't hold in East Asian history. So for all these reasons, United States and China are not necessarily bound to get into conflict, but they could. It kind of depends on, what those in power think and how they read history and how they read structural conditions.
So we could say that the rise of China, or maybe the decline of the West, is the kind of big story of the 21st century.
Well, international relations scholars certainly think so, that they think this is the big story. But, there are other stories, whether that's, in tech or finance or, climate change. There are equally compelling arguments that these structural changes are bigger stories, and US versus China is kind of a smaller story, the larger scheme of things.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are some of those bigger stories?
I mean, in my own work, in my research, I've made the argument that focusing only on US versus China takes us back to a 20th century analogy. Great power competition, US versus USSR, or if you look before World War II, competition of European great powers. But the 20th century was a period where the structure, the background of politics was relatively stable. Of course, there were, scientific changes, and of course, climate was there, but relatively speaking, it was stable. And the better analogy may be for our time, for the 21st century, and this comes out of my last book, Before the West, is perhaps the 17th century. The 17th century was a period where there were big, structural changes, in the realm of economics. There was climate change, in that case, cooling in the northern hemisphere. Of course, you had scientific revolution, all of that. And you have great power competition. we don't focus on it very much because we tend to focus on European history. But as we entered the 17th century, the big great power competition was between arguably the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburgs. Habsburg is a rising power. The Ottoman Empire is as kind of the existing dominant power in the area. But at the end of the 17th century, both had taken major hits, and then suddenly you had all these other new powers, rising powers coming out of Western Europe. So the great power competition that defined the first part of, well, definitely the 16th century and the first part of the 17th century got eclipsed by all these other structural changes. And you could argue in the 21st century, we entered 21st century with US-China competition, but unforeseen changes, well, some of it's foreseen, I suppose, in the realm of climate, in the realm of technology with AI, robotics and all that, how we do, finance, all of that, they may disrupt societies in such a way that, the rules of 20th century no longer apply, and create a long period of disorder, which may then facilitate the rise of other powers.
So one of the big stories in international relations over the last few centuries was the new idea of the nation states. And working for that, we still had great powers, but they were fundamentally structured differently. So what was before the nation states?
Well, traditional answer to this question is to say empires. You had empires before nation states. Right? And certainly you had empires, but you have empires after the nation state too. I think the more defining difference is, whose politics are we talking about? So in the nation state era is the politics of the nation, the people. The state is accountable to the people. Before the nation states era, so let's say before 18th century, globally what you have is well, what I call, the competition of great houses, or you might say, dynastic politics. So you have ruling families, and they tend to, project back in time and think that, ruling families, ruled for the people, but they didn't really. They were ruling for themselves. I mean, you could argue in Europe this started changing earlier. The idea of England or something came a bit earlier than 18th century. But generally, for generalizing to the globe, it's really ruling houses and secondary houses that are trying to facilitate the well-being of their own own relations, and they don't feel before the modern era. They don't really feel accountable to the people.
So what is the source of power then?
The source of power is, well, one could argue, force, but it's not just force. It's a matter of who has a say. The regular people. Again, I'm generalizing because it varies often by region and continent. But the regular people, let's say, in general, don't have much power. They don't have agency. So the people who have agency are aristocrats or, secondary houses. So the great houses, they essentially get their power from the fact that the secondary houses, the middle strata, have submitted to them. So that's where they are seeking support, or they are buying support, through distributing games.
So what's the actual experience like then for somebody on the lower strata of society being ruled by in one empire or another? How does your life change?
It doesn't change very much. Again, we're generalized. So, of course, there are periods when you go back, you can find periods. I mean, I'm talking about like the era right before the modern period, so early modern, what we may call the Middle Ages. If you go back further to the Roman Empire and so on. That is slightly different, of course, but in general, yeah, the regular uh, her people don't care very much, who's who's the official sovereign, because either way they have to, give taxes, or they kind of toil the land. Their fortunes don't change very much. Therefore, they don't have these feelings of attachments. This is nation states. They might have attachments to their village or their immediate environments, their families, of course, but they don't have this larger attachment to the idea of bosom power uh, on this throne. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So a conventional view of history is that the history is full of empires here and there, kingdoms here and there, all kind of disconnected from each other and doing their own thing. And then the European powers come along and through colonization or just through economic trade, connect all of these different parts of the world. But that's too simple. But
Yes. So I would argue that the what we call the modern international order, or sometimes in international relations we call it the Westphalian order, is the last the last example of world orders that have been created. And I use the word world order because, again, if we go before the nation states era, the term international doesn't work. But if we mean by world order some kind of system that connects different groups, different houses, different actors, those beyond the immediate locality, those types of orders have been created many times, and they fall apart, and then they get disconnected, and then they get recreated again. So in my last book, Before the West, I excavated what I called Eastern world orders from this period, starting in the 13th century and ending in the 17th century. And I argue that there were three successive world orders in this period that were centered much more on Asia or Eurasia than in Europe. Europe was quite peripheral to those world orders. But we could go, further back. You could go to deep antiquity. The people like to talk about these days. The late Bronze Age collapse. Which is interesting, from an internationalist perspective. I mean, people like to talk about it because, again, it's another period of disorder. People think maybe there's, elements of comparison between now and that period. But yeah, there was an international or world order around the Eastern Mediterranean at the time, ancient Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and so on. They had a diplomatic system. They were trading. They were often fighting with each other, but they shared certain norms about how foreign affairs should be conducted. And then so that I think that is maybe the first example of an international order, at least the first one we have documentation for, because we have extensive letters. And then that collapses. So that's about 3,000 years ago. And then after that, I think there are others. So the Westphalian or the modern international order is certainly not the first one. It's the first one to reach, a global scale, but we shouldn't ignore the historical example because they give us nice points of comparison.
so how did some of the previous world orders decline, and what were the kind of catalysts for the decline?
Now, if you do, longer history like I do, if you do macro history, what remains, from essentially this is the bird's eye view of what's happening. What remains apparent, when you look at what happened in the past, are usually structural conditions. Sometimes because the evidence is lost about, what the agents, or the individuals around, they were thinking. I mean, even when we have evidence, their decisions seem small when you see the big picture. So I would say, but then of course, when we're writing actual history, we tend to focus on, leaders, what did they think, what mistakes they made, and so on. So there is the kind of a tension between the history that we write of the recent past and the historical sociology, one could say, we construct of the long past. Yeah, so the structural conditions, there's usually some kind of, in the structural pressures, if we're talking about, climatic variability, or I don't know, so they've been there since the beginning, but the way they intersect with politics is when you have an international order or a world order of connected actors, the different parts of the system are not insulated from each other. So if something is happening here, even if this part of the system is not directly affected, they are indirectly affected because they're connected to the part that's being directly affected. If I could simplify that a bit. So in the period that I look at in before the West, the first world order I discuss is what I call, the Thucydides order. It's the world order created by the invasion of the Mongols across Eurasia in the 30th century. That world order comes to an end around the end part of 40th century. Because again, there are a number of structural issues. Trade is disrupted. There's disease. What we call it Black Death. There's like a minor climate issue, and all different parts of the system are affected. Some more, some less. In some cases, the plague causes the end of dynastic lines. So that's one example. Another example is, again, middle of 50th century, the Second World Order. There's shortage of metals. China stops minting coins. Anyway, to make a long story short, trade is disrupted. This affects China less because they're the producers. The west end of the system in West Asia, you have, the collapse across the board because you have all these economies dependent on this trade with China. I suppose what I'm trying to say is the structural pressures that individual parts of the system may be able to bear when they hit at a time when politics are highly interconnected. When there is trade, there's interaction. They start escaping the control of individual decision makers. So the more connected the system, I think the more vulnerable various parts are to these structuring crises.
Right, because an issue in one area can quickly cascade
Yes.
to a different area.
And they kind of amplify. You may have one crisis. If you were kind of isolated, you may be dealing with one crisis. But because you're connected, you're exposed to different ways, and they amplify each other. I mean, I think this is what economic historians like Adam Tooze trying to express the idea of a polycrisis. There's this argument that the 21st century is a moment of polycrisis because we have so many different crises going on. But we talk about climate, finance, tech, great power competition, and all that. But that it's not the first time it's happening, is what I'm saying. The 21st century is not unique in that on a smaller scale, we can see it in previous orders as well. Yes.
What's more important in making two areas part of the same order? Is it ideas like religion, or is it just economic trade and the facts of material movement and so on?
I mean, both are important, but there is only there's only material contact. It's just selling and buying things. I don't think that's evidence of order by itself. Again, I'll go to the antiquity. So if you look at Mesopotamia and Egypt in the beginning, there's evidence that some ideas were shared. We can see in like their in early Egyptian art some influences of Mesopotamian motifs, but later they did evolve in very different directions. Even though there is trade, I, so I think they are in some kind of a system. I mean, the sense that there is a bit of trade, but they don't until late late Bronze, the Amarna International Order. I don't think they're in an order, so that comes later. So for me at least, we know there is a shared order when there's convergence on ways of seeing the world, and that's not necessarily religion. I mean, you could have very different religions, but they're different ideologies, but converge on what matters. So, Cold War United States versus Soviet Union, very different ideologies. In fact, they defined each other. I mean, themselves in opposition to each other. But in terms of what they thought mattered in international politics, there was almost full convergence. Space race, nuclear armament, spheres of influence, that sort of stuff. So the ideologies were different, but how they understood the world and what they were competing about over was very similar. So for me, the Cold War, what's called the Cold War system, is an actual international order, despite the fact that it's a Cold War, because there's such convergence on what they thought mattered. So yeah,
Would it be fair to say that the story of history is humans getting more and more connected over time?
one could argue the 16th century there was already a globalized international order, but then the 17th century is a period of disconnection, disorder, fragmentation, and especially in the aftermath, Asia becomes very regionalized, very fragmented, and it's reconnected through European actors, European colonialism, and so on. So it's not a linear story. It's not that we were all living very separately, and then over time we're just getting more and more connected. I mean, one could argue, in the very beginning, hunter-gatherers, they all came from the same place. So we were very connected at one point, and we dispersed, then we got reconnected. So it's a bit cyclical. One could argue, I mean, the reason I said it's, maybe there's the dialectics to it. After every period of disorder, the next order we create tends to be bigger and involve more connection, having to do with, advancement of technology, ways of moving across space and so on. So if the 21st century becomes defined by disorder and fragmentation and deglobalization, which is certainly a possibility, the way things are headed, that might not be good for us who are alive now, but one could presume that our children will start recreating order at some point, and they will probably have an even more connected one than the one that's is vulnerable to be lost at the moment.
But now, for the first time, we have technology that can connect us all around the world.
Yes.
And so we're highly interconnected. It's not just through the political spheres that we live in, but also directly through technology. How might that change the dynamics of the period of disorder?
Uh, it's difficult to predict because yes, certainly technology, has given us the internet and so on, has given us connectivity like we've never had before. But even that, is debatable because now we've reached a moment where uh, the connectivity itself is a source of disconnection because there's so much noise now. Also, there's it's becoming increasingly difficult to tell like what's real, what's not. So people are uh, being turned off to technology, and they're unplugging, and because they don't like what social media has become, what's internet has become. Uh, or even when they think they're connected, they're not necessarily connected. So I'm not sure just technology by itself solves the problem of connectivity.
It could be that as we kind of fragment and go into smaller groups, though we don't retreat back into our nation states, but rather we retreat into new bubbles. That's just new groups of people across the world that who are connected through technology.
It is possible. So that's one of the reasons. That's another reason why I think the 21st century, the 17th century, is an interesting analogy for the 21st century, because the 17th century was a long period of disorder, and it allowed new forms of politics or political arrangements to rise. I mean, this is really a kind of the birth of the proper birth of the nation state moment in many ways. So long periods of disorder, we've already talked about how they may be disruptive to existing great powers, but they may also be disruptive to existing ways of thinking about the world, about organizing the world, uh, and already uh, we see people having lost trust and faith in 20th century institutions, ideologies. This hasn't yet affected the nation state or people's attachment to nationalism, because in some ways they that's what they're retreating into, to national sentiments. But if the period of disorder and uncertainty lasts for a long time, even that attachment may become weakened. And of course, there are actors who deliberately want to weaken such attachments. We see in the philosophies coming out of the Silicon Valley and so on. We see some people arguing, let's organize by tech people versus non-tech people, or the smart people versus people don't matter. There are these ideas of stratifying society. People will make decisions, others who will lose all their jobs. They what do we do with them? They're already and then of course you have religious actors or argue the nation state is always problematic. Let's retreat back to religious communities. So you see this experimentation with of thought. What's a better way to organize the world according to those actors? At the moment, we don't see them as much of a threat because we take the world as for granted. The way it's been for the last 200 years, it seems very stable to us. It cannot change. But one thing you learn when you look at long direct history, things people thought would be around forever. Pretty much all of them are gone. Uh, Ancient Egyptian religion, let me go back to, and it was around for like 3,000-4,000 years, and hardly a trace, apart from what we see in the museums.
Yeah.
Compared to that, like the religions that we have now, all the the monotheistic religions and so on, they're like they're very young, and we think they've been around forever. Nation state is a baby compared to these other ways of thinking about the world, nationalism. So it may stick around, but it may also be undermined by structural conditions.
So during a period of disorder, who wins and who loses? I know you've spoken about how Europe, in some ways, won in the period of disorder in the 17th century because they were good at adapting to new conditions.
Uh, Yes, I think an advantage that Western Europe, uh, the proto-nation states of Western Europe, so England and France, some extent Netherlands and so on, had in this period of disorder, they didn't have the same attachments to diseases, actual conditions that the Habsburgs had, the Ottomans had, and so on. And as a result, they were more, open to change, more adaptable, but also size. I mean, I think, you know, I think the great powers or the great houses or the great empires of, of an order, they have, exposure in multiple aspects because they, we talked about connectivity being kind of a disadvantage in periods of disorder. So the great powers uh, are connected, more connected than peripheral and middle actors. So again, long periods of disorder, uh, they are less nimble for that reason. So one is mentality, the other one is material exposure. So yeah, so even though most of my colleagues would say what's going to define the 21st century is the US-China competition. Looking at history, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think that there's just there's the possibility that unforeseen players will come to make their mark in 21st century. Okay. uh, I don't know. I mean, that's I can profile actors. Well, Carney had that speech. Middle powers should unite and so on. But he had in mind and was Europe and Canada. But I think that the middle powers elsewhere may be a little bit more better place. I mean, mentality-wise. To take advantage of conditions of uncertainty of this sort. Like if they can couple that with, somehow riding the, changing technology base. I mean, one disadvantage that many of the middle powers outside of Europe, but also Europe has, is that they're kind of getting left behind. I mean, Europe is also in the sport. They're kind of getting left behind by United States and China in terms of technology. Which is why many experts are very confident that this this great power competition will leave everybody else in the dust. But then again, this in my field, people were making the same arguments about the Soviet Union and the United States. Uh, so yeah, I mean, I'm not a gambling person, but I think it would be if I were, I think the better bet is some of the middle powers, the right combination of um, riding the technology wave and the right mindsets, rather than US or China.
So what should Europe and Britain do kind of politically to prepare?
What Europe and Britain have to do is elect leaders who do not have very strong attachments to 20th century politics. So the problem that I see with the general leadership, this is true certainly in the UK, but also in many European countries, whether of left-wing or right-wing orientation. European leaders think that they are still in the 20th century. That's how they read the United States. There's this expectation that Europe has, the United States relations with the United States will go back to normal. Europe has no other options but to go with the United States. And I'm not saying Europe or UK should alienate the United States, but it's what I think what's going to happen in this, in the near future is kind of a normalization of Europe's role in world politics. By normalization, I mean uh, the special status that Europe and United Kingdom occupied in the international order uh, is no longer going to be there. And United Kingdom and other European countries will be just like other middle powers. Uh, and the sooner we, accept that reality, the the better we will strategize. Uh, that's attachment to this idea that United Kingdom has a special relationship, or Europe, uh, you know, is one of the rule makers of the international order at large, uh, on equal footing with the United States, which is kind of a pretense that everybody kind of uh, held onto for historical legacy reasons in the 20th century. None of that is going to be there, and middle powers who don't occupy special positions, they have to think differently about the world. They may have to hedge. They may have to play great powers against each other, or even if they don't want to, they may have to give the indication that they could, in order to have some leverage. I think that's the first step, letting go of the 20th century.
Yeah. For the smaller countries, what was the lesson from the Cold War? Is it better to pick a side or better to be non-aligned?
Uh, it's a difficult question to answer. I mean, I think it varies by country. I mean, for Western Europe, alignments in the Cold War worked out really well. I mean, one could argue I'm originally from Turkey, for Turkey so it's as well. So, yeah, so it's it's not a question that has a straightforward answer. And also, like IR international relations experts would argue that once the camps form, in bipolarity, you don't have that many options. Also, when I speak of hedging or leveraging, I'm thinking more of a period of disorder and uncertainty when the options haven't yet narrowed, when you have this possibility of maneuver. So that's what I mean.
What is a legitimation crisis?
Uh, a legitimation crisis is when an international order, well, any kind of order actually, uh, is not delivering on its foundational promises. So, I mean, we talked about ideas versus material factors to constructing an order. So you need to have the material basis of that order, trade, defense, all of that, security. But then every order, I mean, whether we're talking about like their local order or an international world order, every order, every political order has a story about itself. Why the people in charge deserve to be in charge, and that's varies across history. So in the world orders I looked at that were based on Eurasia, 13th to 17th century, the basic story was, well, all political authority was centered on one person, the ruler, and that person was a world conqueror. I mean, it sounds a little bit tautological, but basically what it meant is as long as there was expansion and conquest, the secondary houses, people's opinion mattered in that order. They couldn't challenge the authority. When conquest ended, that's produced the legitimation crisis, even if otherwise conditions were good. Now we have Pax Mongolica, for instance, a period of relative peace, economic prosperity, but it's a problem within the ideology of that order because there's no conquest. Similarly, the Ottoman Empire, which was an heir to that kind of model, after the 17th century, they recovered. Even economically, they recovered in the 18th century in some ways, but conquest stopped. And as soon as conquest stopped, from that period on, in the Ottoman Empire is constantly facing the Ottoman rulers are constantly facing legitimation crises. They're not conquering, and if you're not conquering, what good are you? As a so there's that kind of expectation built into the system. The modern international order legitimizes itself. So different aspects, of course. You know, I mean, it's a complicated story. Because apart from the nation state, there is an implicit and later explicit principle of sovereign equality and treating nation states equally and with respect. Later liberal international order, it says if you meet certain metrics, you will be treated this way. It's a meritocratic system. It's a fair system.
Yeah.
And when it's starts, and of course it was never fully living up to those promises. So it's to some extent its legitimation crisis is ongoing. But when legitimation crisis meets with structural crises, then those are precarious moments.
Right. So I choose which AI model I'm going to use based on what I think about the CEO.
Okay.
Are we all going to be living in different tech empires?
It's certainly a possibility. Yes. Yeah, I mean, we've already talked about, periods of disorder and fragmentation being times of, experimentation with new ways of organizing the world. One way is certainly, where's AI company overlords. We're all getting hooked into these systems, which start free or relatively, easy to access. But then, no, I mean, that's at the individual basis, but then, they're also getting integrated with, state level services and also educational institutions, even though there's now a backlash against this. But a lot of these decisions were made without, consulting anybody. So it's not hard to imagine, apart from your choice of, CEO, there may come a moment where you don't have a choice. And, once, just as, NHS gave, our data to Palante without asking, all of the UK is under the control of one AI company, or all of Europe. And that's why, and that certainly would be another way of organizing politics. It already exists as science fiction. If you've seen the recent adaptation of that came out of the Alien universe, have you seen Alien Earth? It's a kind of a dystopic near future. It's within the if you know the Alien movies, it's that future. But on Alien Earth, you get a better sense of the politics of what's happening on Earth, and it's essentially the world governed by 7 companies, who are headed by at least some of them, the ones that we see are like technical type of sovereigns. Yes, so yeah, the science fiction writers are maybe ahead of some of our international relations theorists. Sometimes just imagine, yes,
What's one period from history that people today should go and read about, to learn about, and prepare for what might come?
Well, I think, I mean, it's hard to pick. For me, it's hard to pick one period. Based on my last book and the comparisons I've drawn in this conversation, I would say, read about the 70s century. But now I'm working on a new book, which it's a world history of strongman, or actually it's like an anti history of strongman, and that starts with it's basically all of history, and I start with the hunter gatherers, I've come to the present, and I'm making an argument that what we call strongman or one-man rule is actually quite rare in history. Even without democracy, people have always found ways of holding individual rulers accountable, making them act in a constrained way. And when one-man rule emerges, it usually doesn't work. It's I mean, usually when there's one, there's a succession of them. But after a while, it's not a system that will sustain itself. It's not great to live through, but again, the long big picture view is these periods are fleeting, and the historical norm is more in favor of people than we think, of the general people. So I guess the answer to your question is any period of history, because I find hope in history. Long during history gives me hope. After periods of disorder or periods of, destruction, the Mongol conquests, which start my last book, a great period of devastation. But then they did also connect the world, and they had all these unintended positive effects in some way. So on balance, I think, although I don't believe in linear progress, I believe on balance, I have hope for humanity. Yeah.
Great. Ayşe Zarakol, thank you so much.
Thank you.